The ground shakes with a violence beyond any living memory. An entire coastline suddenly drops, and a towering wall of water swallows the land. This is not a scene from a movie. It is the geological future of the Pacific Northwest, waiting within the Cascadia Subduction Zone. But this story is not only about the cataclysm to come. It is about the one that arrived over 3 centuries ago and the history it erased. By the end of this journey, you will understand how a single night of terror wiped entire native villages from the earth and memory, and how we are only now piecing their world back together. Where did these communities vanish to, and what secrets lie buried beneath our feet? What does a ghost forest have to tell us about the day the world shook? How much of our history is simply waiting to be remembered? The story begins far beneath the waves. Off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, a slow-motion collision has been underway for millions of years. Here, a small tectonic plate called the Juan de Fuca is being forced, inch by relentless inch, underneath the massive North American plate. Think of it like a piece of wood being shoved under a rug. The edge of the continent, the rug, is being slowly dragged down, bending and compressing. For centuries, it stores this energy, locked in a titanic struggle. This 700-mile-long fault line is the Cascadia Subduction Zone, and it is a geological spring, coiled tighter and tighter with every passing year. The pressure cannot build forever. Eventually, the fault must slip. The continent, held down for so long, will snap back upward in a violent rebound. This is not a gentle tremor. It is the full, catastrophic release of centuries of stored energy in a matter of minutes. We know this because it has happened before. On the night of January 26th in the year 1700, the spring finally uncoiled. The resulting earthquake is estimated to have been a magnitude 9.0 or higher. The entire coastline from northern California to southern British Columbia suddenly dropped by several feet and lurched westward. But for a long time, this was just a theory, a ghost in the geological record. The proof came from across an ocean. In Japan, meticulous records kept in coastal villages documented an orphan tsunami. A massive wave struck their shores with no local earthquake to explain it. By tracing the timing of this wave back across the Pacific, scientists were able to pinpoint its origin. The math was undeniable. The tsunami had been generated at 9 in the evening Pacific time on that specific January night. The Cascadia Subduction Zone had spoken, and its voice was a roar that echoed across the world's greatest ocean. This single event confirmed a terrifying reality. The Pacific Northwest does not just experience earthquakes. It is built upon a sleeping giant, one that wakes roughly every 500 years. The last wake-up call was over 3 centuries ago. The stage is not merely set for a repeat. The clock is already counting down. That roar in the year 1700 left a signature on the land, one we can still see today. Along the coastlines of Oregon and Washington, in quiet tidal estuaries and salt marshes, stand sentinels of a forgotten world. They are called ghost forests. These are not living trees. They are the skeletal remains of vast cedar and spruce forests, their trunks bleached silver by centuries of sun and salt, their branches stripped bare. They look like they were petrified where they stood, and in a way they were. These giants did not die of old age or disease. They were murdered in a single night. Their roots tell the story. They are still firmly anchored in soil that was once freshwater forest floor, far from the ocean's reach, but the ground beneath them betrayed them. When the Cascadia Fault ruptured, hundreds of miles of coastline suddenly subsided, dropping several feet in an instant. The land these trees called home was plunged downward. Seawater rushed in, flooding their root systems with salt. A towering Sitka spruce, a tree that can live for 800 years, cannot survive that. The salt water poisoned them, and they died standing up, a stark monument to the land's sudden descent. But how do we know this happened in the winter of 1699 to 1700? We ask the trees themselves. Scientists called dendrochronologists, which simply means tree ring scientists, examined these ghostly stumps. They took core samples, reading the rings like pages in a diary. The final growth ring on every one of these trees was formed in the growing season of 1699. There is no ring for the year 1700. The trees did not wake up that spring. More precisely, their death is stamped in the wood. The outer rings are compressed and stressed, showing the trees were struggling even before the final event. Then the record simply stops. This precise dating is the physical proof, the undeniable fingerprint left at the scene. The ghost forests are not just eerie scenery. They are the first major clue, a direct line from our present landscape back to that catastrophic night. They tell us exactly when the world fell, and they stand as silent witnesses to the sheer power that rearranged the very coast. If the trees could talk, what stories of terror would they tell of that shaking, the roar of the ocean, and the silent, creeping death of the saltwater flood? But the ghost forests are only part of the story. To find the full truth, you have to look down. Beneath the calm surface of modern salt marshes and tidal mudflats, geologists have uncovered a hidden landscape. Using simple tools like hand-driven core tubes, they pull up cylinders of earth, reading the layers like chapters in a history book, and what they find is astonishing. Just a few feet down, beneath layers of gray tidal mud, they strike a thick, black, fibrous layer. It is peat, the preserved remains of an ancient freshwater marsh or forest floor. This is the soil where those ghost forest trees once spread their roots. It is a snapshot of a vibrant, sunlit world, instantly frozen in time, and directly on top of this buried soil, they find something else, a sharp, sudden deposit of sand, often mixed with tiny seashells. This is the tsunami's calling card, the material ripped from the ocean floor and the beach, then dumped inland as the wall of water retreated. This sequence, the lush soil, then the sand, then the tidal mud, is the geological signature of the megaquake. It tells a clear story. First the land dropped, drowning the forest. Then the tsunami swept in, burying it. Finally, the new, lower coastline became a tidal flat, and the slow accumulation of mud began, sealing the past away. The Salmon River estuary in Oregon is a textbook example. Here, the buried peat layer is so extensive and well-preserved, it is like opening a time capsule. Scientists can walk out into the modern marsh, push down a corer, and pull up a piece of the forest floor from the day before the quake. At Copali's Beach in Washington, the same story is written in the earth. The contrast is jarring. One moment you are standing on a quiet, grassy marsh, and just beneath your feet is the graveyard of an entire ecosystem. These buried marshes are more than just evidence. They are the actual ground where people lived. This was not a vacant wilderness. For thousands of years, these very estuaries, with their rich soils and abundant resources, were the homelands of thriving native communities. The same geological forces that drowned the trees and buried the peat would have utterly transformed their world in a single, horrifying night. The question shifts from what happened to the land to who was standing on it when it fell. For the people living on that ancient, now buried soil, the world did not simply change, it ended. The geological evidence tells us what happened to the land. To understand what happened to the people, we must turn to a different kind of record, one held not in layers of sand but in generations of memory. Across the Pacific Northwest, from Northern California to Vancouver Island, the indigenous tribes possess stories. These are not vague legends of a distant mythical past. They are precise, harrowing accounts of survival, passed from elder to child for over 300 years. The Tillamook, the Clatsop, the Coos, the Chinook, and many others all tell versions of the same night. They speak of a great shaking so violent that people could not stand, of the earth roaring like thunder. They tell of the ocean suddenly drawing back, leaving fish flopping on the exposed seafloor, a fatal lure that drew the curious to their doom. Then, they say, the water returned, not as waves but as a mountain moving across the land. Canoes were thrown into the tops of trees. Whole villages were swept away or swallowed by the ground. Many stories describe a desperate flight to high ground, a race for survival that left deep scars on the community's memory. One of the most powerful narratives comes from the Maka people, who speak of a great battle between Thunderbird and Whale. In their tradition, the Thunderbird is a colossal supernatural being, whose wingbeats create thunder and whose flashing eyes are lightning. The Whale is a mighty creature of the deep. When they fought, the earth shook, the mountains crumbled, and the sea rose up in fury. For a long time, Western scholars dismissed this as a symbolic myth. Now we hear it differently. It is a perfect metaphor, born from direct experience. The shaking of the earth is the thrashing of the giants. The tsunami is the churning of the sea from their struggle. This is not fantasy, it is eyewitness testimony, encoded in the cultural language of the people who were there. These oral histories are meticulous records. They note the time of year, the suddenness of the event, the sequence of the earthquake and then the wave. They correspond with chilling accuracy to what the ghost forests and the buried soils tell us. This convergence is profound. It means we are not looking at two separate stories, one of rocks and trees and one of people. We are looking at a single catastrophic event, remembered in two parallel ways. The science gives us the date, January 26, 1700. The oral histories give us the human truth of that date, the terror, the loss, and the sheer struggle to live through it. They confirm that the land was not empty, it was home, and when the ground fell, it took entire chapters of human history with it. Before that winter night, the coastline was a gentler, more intricate place. Picture not the dramatic cliffs and exposed beaches we often see today, but a lacework of sheltered waterways. Countless rivers met the sea through broad, calm estuaries. Behind sandy spits, freshwater lagoons teemed with life. These were not just scenic features, they were the foundation of civilization. The calm, protected waters were highways for canoes, connecting villages. The estuaries were nurseries for salmon and rich in shellfish. The freshwater marshes and forests provided berries, roots, and materials for building. This was a landscape engineered by time to support a dense, thriving network of communities. Villages dotted these sheltered shores, their cedar longhouses facing the water, their smokehouses full, their canoes pulled up on muddy banks. It was a world of abundance, stability, and deep connection to a very specific environment. Then, in minutes, that world was unmade. The first blow was the drop. As the fault uncoiled, the entire coastal edge sank, as if a giant hand pressed it down. This was not a slow sinking, but a sudden, catastrophic subsidence of 3 to 6 feet or more. Imagine the ground you are standing on just falling away beneath you. Where there was a freshwater marsh, salt water now poured in. A village built safely above the high tide line suddenly found its floors underwater with each new tide. The very soil that grew edible plants was poisoned by salt. The land literally shrank, pushing the ocean miles inland in some places, drowning the forests and turning familiar homelands into expanding bays. But the ocean was not finished. Following the earthquake by perhaps 20 minutes came the tsunami. This was not a single wave, but a moving mountain of water. Surging inland from the deep ocean, it would have reached unimaginable heights, 30 to 40 feet or more, as it funneled into those very estuaries and river valleys. That which made the coast so perfect for life now made it a death trap. The wall of water scoured everything in its path. It ripped houses from their foundations, smashed canoes into splinters, and tore entire villages from the map. It carried millions of tons of sand and debris inland, burying what the water did not destroy. When the survivors, those who had fled to the hills or were simply lucky, emerged from the terror, they looked upon a world they did not recognize. The landmarks were gone, the fishing grounds were buried under sand or drowned in deep, salty water. The forests where they gathered materials were now dead gray sentinels in a salt marsh. The gentle coastline of estuaries and lagoons was reshaped into a raw, flooded, and barren version of its former self. Their home was not just damaged, it was fundamentally alien, a ghost of the abundant world they had known just hours before. This left archaeologists with a haunting question: where are the villages? For generations, the written history of the northwest coast began with European explorers and settlers. Men like Lewis and Clark, arriving a century after the quake, documented a landscape they often described as sparsely populated, even empty in places. They wrote of encountering native peoples, but the dense network of communities described in earlier, fleeting contacts and held firmly in oral tradition seemed to have vanished. The official record suggested these places were myths, or that the people had simply moved on, but the stories and the geology told a different, more violent tale. The villages did not fade away, they were erased. Finding them became a detective story with an immense and waterlogged crime scene. The challenge was monumental. These were not cities of stone. People lived in longhouses built from massive cedar posts and planks, with walls of woven reed mats. When abandoned or destroyed, wood rots. Mats disintegrate. In the damp coastal environment, organic materials return to the earth with startling speed. A village abandoned after the tsunami might leave nothing visible on the surface within a single human lifetime. The evidence would be subtle: a pattern of stains in the soil where posts once stood, a scatter of stone tools or broken shells, a hearth buried under layers of mud. To find them, archaeologists had to think like the survivors of 1700. They had to ignore the modern coastline and reconstruct the ancient one, searching not where villages are today, but where they would have been before the land sank and the waves scoured it clean. They began to look in the very places that seemed least promising: the quiet salt marshes and tidal flats. Could the same mud that buried the ghost forests also have preserved the footprints of the people who lived among them? The search required a way to see through the forest, to peel back 3 centuries of regrowth. That tool arrived from the sky, and it works with light. It is called light detection and ranging, or LiDAR for short. Imagine flying a specialized plane over the dense, nearly impenetrable coastal rainforests of the Pacific Northwest. From the belly of that plane, a laser scanner fires hundreds of thousands of light pulses every second down toward the earth. Most of these pulses hit the leaves and branches of the towering trees, but a precious few find their way through tiny gaps in the canopy, all the way to the actual ground. By measuring the precise time it takes for each pulse to bounce back, a computer can build an astonishingly detailed, 3-dimensional map of the bare Earth surface, digitally stripping away every single tree, bush, and fern. What remains is a ghost image of the true terrain, a landscape naked of vegetation, and on that landscape, the faintest human fingerprints suddenly become visible. The gentle, circular depression of a collapsed longhouse, now just a subtle bowl in the earth, a series of flattened terraces carved into a hillside where multiple homes once stood in a row. The smooth, worn path leading from a village site down to a waterway, a canoe run used for generations. Even the piles of ancient discarded shells, called middens, appear as slight mounds. These features have been hiding in plain sight for centuries, masked by a blanket of salal and vine maple. To an archaeologist walking through that forest, these signs are nearly impossible to see. But from the perspective of a laser pulse, the story is written plainly on the ground. This technology is not just helpful, it is revolutionary. It allows researchers to survey vast, rugged areas in a fraction of the time it would take on foot, pinpointing exactly where to look. It transforms an overwhelming search into a targeted investigation. LiDAR does not find the villages themselves, but it reveals their shadows, the architectural echoes pressed into the soil. It shows us where people shaped the land to fit their lives, creating a permanent record that even a megaquake and a tsunami could not completely obliterate. With this new map in hand, the real digging could begin, not with blind hope, but with a clear target. What would they find when they finally put a trowel into one of those mysterious, laser-revealed depressions? Nehalem Bay, with its sweeping curve of sand and deep blue water, holds a secret beneath its quiet beauty. For the Tillamook people, this was not just a scenic spot, it was a center of the world. Their oral histories speak of a large and prosperous village here, a community of cedar longhouses facing the bay, a place of trade and ceremony and deep roots. They also tell of its violent end, swallowed by the shaking earth and the great wave. For generations, this story was a memory, a ghost on the landscape. But what if that ghost left a physical trace? The search for answers at Nehalem Bay perfectly illustrates the modern hunt, a partnership between enduring memory and cutting-edge sight. Archaeologists, guided by the Tillamook narratives, turned their tools to the bay's edges. They knew the coastline had sunk, so they looked inland from the modern shore, focusing on forested terraces that would have been perfect village sites before the land dropped. LiDAR surveys flown over the dense stands of spruce and alder revealed the subtle signatures of human habitation, gentle depressions and flattened areas arranged in lines along what would have been the ancient shoreline. These were not natural features. They matched the expected pattern of house platforms, places where massive posts were set and longhouses built. To peer beneath the soil without disturbing it, researchers then used ground-penetrating radar. This device sends radio waves into the ground and measures the echoes that bounce back, creating a sonogram of the subsurface. The scans showed not just the outlines of possible structures, but also thick, distinct layers of organic material mixed with shell. These are middens, the ancient garbage heaps that are treasure troves to archaeologists. A midden is a time capsule of daily life, containing discarded tools, fragments of bone, charcoal from hearths, and millions of broken shells, a direct record of what people ate and how they lived. Finding these deposits on terraces that are now heavily forested, a mile or more from the active beach, is powerful evidence. It confirms that people lived right here, on what was once prime coastal real estate, before it was suddenly rendered inland and flooded. The story of Nehalem Bay is no longer just a legend. It is a map written in tree shadows and radar echoes, a conversation between a people's memory and the silent testimony of the soil. This blend of tech and tradition is turning whispers from the past into a clear, compelling narrative, proving that these lost villages are not mythical, but merely missing, waiting to be acknowledged once more. The story of the land is written in layers, but the story of the people is written in their refuse. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, the most enduring signs of ancient villages are not grand monuments, but piles of discarded shells. These are middens, accumulations of clams, oysters, and mussels that built up over centuries, mixed with charcoal from fires, broken tools, and animal bones. To an archaeologist, a midden is a library. Its layers hold a continuous record of daily life, diet, and technology. For generations, these shell heaps marked the map of human habitation, visible mounds along the shoreline. Yet after the 1700 quake, many of these vital records simply vanished from sight. They did not crumble away. They were drowned and buried, sinking beneath the very waves that provided their bounty. To find them, you have to think like the earth moved, and then you have to drill straight down. Consider Silet's Bay on the central Oregon coast. Today, it is a serene expanse of tidal flats and marsh grass, a quiet haven for birds. But core samples pulled from its soft, muddy heart tell a violent, transformative tale. Archaeologists and geologists work in tandem here, using hollow metal tubes called corers. They drive these tubes deep into the bay mud, sometimes 10, 15, or 20 feet down. What they pull up is a timeline in compacted dirt. The top layers are recent tidal silt, soft and gray. But as the corer goes deeper, it suddenly strikes something hard, something that grits against the metal. They extract the core tube and split it open. Inside, beneath feet of uniform mud, they find a dense, black layer teeming with fragments of shell. This is a buried midden, a kitchen midden from a village that once sat on dry land at the edge of an estuary. Directly above this shell layer, they often find a deposit of fine sand, the unmistakable fingerprint of the tsunami that swept over the site. Then, on top of it all, the thick, sterile mud of the new, submerged coastline that formed after the land sank. This vertical sequence is a silent, profound testimony. It means the people of that village were processing and eating shellfish right here, on solid ground. Then, in a geological instant, their home was scoured by the wave and plunged beneath the waterline. The bay advanced, and over the centuries, a thick blanket of sediment settled over the ruins of their daily life. The village did not fade away, it was entombed. These sunken middens are ghost towns of a different kind, not marked by standing posts but by submerged feasts. Every clam shell fragment, every fire-cracked rock pulled from that deep, dark layer is a voice from a community that was literally lowered beneath the waves. Finding them requires rejecting the map you see and believing in the one that existed before the world shook. It is detective work that operates on a vertical scale, reading downward into time to find the horizons where people lived. Each core sample is a message in a bottle, but the bottle is made of mud, and the message is written in shell and stone. What other conversations are waiting, frozen in the deep mud of every quiet bay along this coast? For a village built on a low, sandy spit, the tsunami offered no escape. It was a total, immediate erasure. Imagine the force needed to rip a 50-foot cedar log from the beach and drive it like a spear deep into a forest. That is the power that struck these coastal settlements. The wave did not politely flood the longhouses, it dismantled them. Massive roof planks became battering rams. Support posts were snapped like twigs. Entire structures were lifted from their foundations, torn into a chaotic soup of splintered wood, woven mats, and personal belongings, then carried inland on a churning tide of sand and seawater. What remained was not a village, but a scattering of debris across a newly rearranged landscape. This is where archaeology becomes a form of forensics, searching for the fragments of a life shattered and dispersed. The key is in the sand, that distinct layer of tsunami-deposited sand, which geologists use to mark the event, can also contain cultural evidence. Archaeologists meticulously sift through these layers, not looking for a village site, but for its echoes. A single finely crafted stone spear point, found nestled among seashells and beach sand 20 feet above and 100 yards inland from the modern shore. A cluster of fire-cracked rocks from a hearth, now scattered and buried under 2 feet of sand in what is now a quiet meadow. A fragment of a canoe paddle or a stone net sinker, both carried far from any possible river or beach. These are not random lost items. They are refugees from a destroyed home. Each artifact is a data point, plotting the path of the wave's destructive force and the former location of the community it consumed. Finding a stone tool within a tsunami sand layer is a profoundly sobering discovery. It directly links the human story to the geological event in the most violent way possible. It tells us that someone was holding that tool, or using that hearth, at the very moment the ocean arrived. These scattered cultural deposits are the physical proof of the oral histories that speak of villages being swept clean away. They confirm that for some communities, the Cascadia quake was not a disaster from which they could rebuild. It was an ending so complete that only these fragmented, buried clues remained, waiting centuries for someone to understand their tragic significance. The scattered stone tools and buried hearths are not just evidence of destruction, they are the starting point for a far more profound story. The megaquake was a cataclysm, but it was not an ending for the people. Cultures are not buildings, they are living traditions carried in memory and language. When the ground stilled and the waters receded, the survivors faced an unimaginable reality. Their homes were gone, their landscape poisoned, their stored food and canoes likely destroyed. In that moment, the choice was stark: perish or adapt. The human response to this disaster was not disappearance, it was a profound and resilient reset. We must think beyond the empty village sites. The people who lived there did not vanish into thin air. Oral histories from numerous tribes speak not only of the event, but of what came after. They tell of survivors gathering, of long journeys to find kin, of merging with neighboring bands who may have been on higher ground and suffered less. A village that lost half its people to the wave could not function alone. They would have sought out relatives or allies, bringing their stories, their skills, and their grief into a new community. This merging of populations is a survival strategy as old as humanity itself. It explains a curious pattern noted by early European settlers and anthropologists, the incredible linguistic and cultural diversity packed into the northwest coast. This mosaic may be, in part, a legacy of that 17th century reset, a tapestry woven from the threads of many shattered communities. Migration was the other key to survival. The old village site, now a saltwater marsh or a sand-choked flat, was no longer a home. The salmon streams might be blocked, the clam beds buried, the freshwater springs contaminated. The land itself had become inhospitable, so the survivors moved. They followed rivers upstream to where the shaking was less severe and the tsunami did not reach. They relocated to new bays, to higher terraces, to places where the ancient landscape still functioned. These movements are embedded in the stories, a narrative might say. Our ancestors lived by the great water, but after the battle of Thunderbird and Whale, we moved up this river to these falls. This is not a mythic origin story, it is a historical migration record. This perspective changes everything about the lost villages. They were not lost to the people who came from them. Their location was forgotten over generations by outsiders because the people were no longer there to point them. When European explorers arrived a century later, they mapped what they saw, a coastline still recovering, with populations concentrated in new areas. They recorded the villages of their time, unaware they were looking at a rearranged human map. The old sites, overgrown by new forest or submerged by the sea, faded from active memory into the realm of sacred history, kept alive in ceremony and story. The villages did not disappear because the people died out. They disappeared because the people, with incredible resilience, chose to live somewhere else, carrying their world with them in their canoes and in their songs. This survival reshaped the cultural landscape as powerfully as the quake reshaped the physical one. It forces us to ask, if the people moved, what did they bring with them, and what did they have to leave behind in the drowned earth? High on the fog-shrouded slopes of Nikoni Mountain, overlooking the very ocean that brought the tsunami, lies a different kind of ghost story. For generations, settlers have whispered about a lost city or a buried Spanish treasure somewhere on that steep, forested face. They speak of mysterious symbols carved into stone, of a lone figure seen burying a chest long ago, and of a fortune in gold and silver waiting to be found. It is a classic Pacific Northwest legend, a tale of hidden riches that has drawn treasure hunters for over a century. But what if this story, like the oral histories of the tribes, is a fractured memory of a real loss? What if the treasure is not Spanish gold, but something far older and more profound? The slopes of Nikoni, like much of the Oregon coast, are incredibly unstable. They are a layered cake of ancient volcanic rock and softer sandstone, constantly undercut by the pounding sea. A major earthquake does more than shake the ground, it can liquefy entire hillsides. The 1700 quake would have triggered massive landslides all along this rugged coastline. Imagine the sound, a deep, grinding roar joining the quake's thunder as whole sections of mountain tore free, sliding into the ocean or burying the shoreline under millions of tons of rock and earth. Now consider a village situated at the base of such a slope, a community that had thrived there for centuries. In minutes, it would not just be flooded, it would be entombed. A landslide of that scale creates a literal time capsule, sealing everything beneath it in an instant. The stories of something valuable lost on the mountain may hold a kernel of truth, but the treasure is cultural. It is the lost village itself, its longhouses, tools, and artifacts preserved under a mountain of debris. The mysterious stone carvings treasure hunters seek could very well be indigenous petroglyphs, marking a site of significance that was later buried by the slide. The lone figure bearing a chest transforms, in this light, from a Spanish sailor into a symbolic memory of the land itself covering a world. This reframing turns a fanciful legend into a potential archaeological map. The persistent tale points to a specific, dramatic landscape and insists something important is hidden there. Geologists know the area is prone to catastrophic slides. Tribal histories speak of the land's violence. The legend of Nikoni Mountain, then, might be a tangled thread connecting all three, a settler-era echo of a much older, deeper loss. It suggests that even stories that seem like pure fantasy can be guideposts, drawing our attention back to the real and violent history written into the cliffs. The true treasure hunt is not for gold, but for understanding, a search through the rubble of a shaken world for the pieces of a past we are only beginning to hear. A village is more than its houses, it is a relationship with a living landscape. The true measure of the disaster was not just the broken homes, but the broken lifelines. Every coastal community existed within a precise web of resources, a map written not on paper, but in the memory of elders and the rhythm of daily life. They knew exactly which stand of ancient cedar provided the perfect, straight-grained logs for ocean-going canoes. They knew the precise bend in the river where the salmon ran thickest each spring. They knew the hidden tidal flat where the butter clams grew fat and sweet. This knowledge, accumulated over centuries, was the foundation of their wealth, their culture, and their very survival. In one night, the Megaquake redrew that entire map. The towering cedars, their roots drowned in salt water, began their slow death into ghost forests. The very material needed to build homes and canoes was now poison to itself, a standing resource that was suddenly useless, but the destruction went deeper. The violent shaking and sudden subsidence could alter the course of rivers and streams. A crucial salmon spawning ground might be left high and dry as its channel shifted, or smothered under a landslide of mud and debris. The salmon, a sacred and central food source, would simply not return to that place. The most direct devastation was to the shellfish beds. The tsunami did not just wash over the clam beds, it buried them. It scoured the ocean floor and the beaches, dumping feet of sterile sand over the rich, muddy flats where clams and oysters thrived. Overnight, a pantry that had fed generations was sealed shut under a thick, impenetrable blanket. Imagine the survivors returning to the shore in the days after the quake. The shaking has stopped, the terrible waves have receded, they have lost family and friends. But now they must face a quieter, more insidious crisis. They go to their traditional clam digging spot, and their digging sticks strike not soft mud, but hard-packed sand as deep as they can dig. They look to the forest for materials to rebuild and see the needles of the cedars already turning brown. They wait for the salmon run at their ancestral fishing platform, and the river runs empty, its course altered or its headwaters blocked. Their entire economic engine has been shattered. A community could withstand the loss of its buildings. It could not withstand the loss of its reason for being in that exact location. The land itself had revoked its invitation. This is why so many villages were truly lost, not just damaged. Staying meant starvation and cultural collapse. The trauma of the quake was followed by the slow, grim realization that their world was no longer capable of supporting them. The decision to leave was not an abandonment of home, it was a final heartbreaking act of adaptation. They packed what they could carry, their stories, their songs, and their memories of the old landscape, and they walked away from the drowned forests and the buried feasts, seeking a new place where the earth still remembered how to provide. The sand itself holds secrets too small for the eye to see. When scientists examine these tsunami deposits under a microscope, the story becomes astonishingly personal. They are not just looking at grains of quartz and feldspar, they are sifting through the microscopic wreckage of a day. Within that coarse, foreign layer of sand, they sometimes find flecks of charcoal. This is not charcoal from a forest fire scattered by the wind. It has a specific signature. Under high magnification, you can see the cellular structure of wood, and it is often from species like cedar or spruce, trees people used for building and fuel. This charcoal likely came from a hearth that was ripped apart by the rushing water, its contents scattered and buried. Even more telling are fragments of burned bone, so tiny they look like grit. These could be from a meal cooking when the quake struck, or from food stores within a house. The wave did not discriminate. It took everything in its path and mixed it into a terrible soup of sand and memory. Perhaps the most subtle clue of all is pollen. Pollen grains are incredibly resilient, and each plant species has a unique shape. Scientists analyzing these sand layers might find a sudden, anomalous spike in the pollen of a plant like camas, a lily with a nutritious bulb that was a staple food and was actively managed and cultivated in open meadows. Finding a concentrated burst of camas pollen in a tsunami deposit, far from where it would naturally grow, is like finding a fingerprint. It suggests the wave scoured through a cultivated garden or a processing area, carrying that distinct botanical signature inland and depositing it with the sand. This is evidence of human landscaping, of a relationship with the land, captured in a moment of catastrophe. These microscopic traces transform the sand layer from a simple geological marker into a poignant time capsule. They tell us that people were not just somewhere in the region. They were right there on that spot, living their lives, tending their fires, and working their gardens in the very hours before the ocean arrived. The wave did not hit an empty coast. It interrupted a world in motion, and it froze that moment in a layer of sand and invisible ash. If the ghost forests show us the death of the land, and the buried soils show us the drowning of the earth, these microscopic clues show us the abrupt end of a day. They are the final, fleeting echoes of the ordinary life that filled those lost villages, a whisper of smoke and pollen carried on a wave of unimaginable power. Across the Pacific, the story of that night was written in water. In the winter of 1700, villages along the eastern coast of Japan experienced something deeply unsettling. The sea withdrew, then returned as a powerful, damaging tsunami, yet the ground beneath their feet remained still. No earthquake had preceded the wave. To the meticulous record keepers of the time, this was an anomaly, a mystery. They called it an orphan tsunami, a destructive force with no parent quake to explain its arrival. For nearly 300 years, this event remained a curious footnote in Japanese historical documents, a puzzle with no solution. How could the ocean rise in fury without the earth first trembling? The answer lay in a blind spot of contemporary science, the belief that a massive subduction zone earthquake could not happen in the Pacific Northwest. Japanese seismologists, studying their own country's long history of quakes and tsunamis, kept meticulous records of these orphan waves. They knew the timing, they knew the height, but the origin point was a blank on the map. The breakthrough came in the 1990s, when a team of scientists led by Kenji Satake began to work backward. They used the detailed Japanese records, which noted the tsunami arrived at various points along the coast around midnight on January 27, 1700, Japan time. By calculating the travel time of a tsunami across the entire width of the Pacific Ocean, they could trace the wave's origin backward, like following the ripples in a pond to find where the stone was dropped. The math was inescapable. The orphan tsunami had been generated at 9 in the evening Pacific time on January 26th. The only possible source along that longitude was the Cascadia Subduction Zone. This was the clinching evidence, the precise timestamp the ghost forests and oral histories had been waiting for. January 26, 1700, was no longer an estimate. It was a historical fact confirmed by an independent witness an ocean away. This connection did more than just date the quake, it redefined its scale. For a tsunami to remain powerful enough to cause damage after crossing 5,000 miles of open ocean, the earthquake that spawned it had to be monstrous, a magnitude 9.0 or higher. The Japanese records validated the sheer, global power of the event that had reshaped the Oregon coast. Suddenly, the local catastrophe was part of a planetary story. The same wave that drowned cedar forests and buried villages in the Pacific Northwest also smashed into fishing boats and storehouses in Japan hours later. This scientific detective work wove together two separate strands of history, proving that the world's oceans are not barriers, but connectors. The validation from Japan gave immense weight to the native oral traditions. It confirmed that the stories of that terrible night were not symbolic myths, but precise accounts of a real, datable, world-altering event. The Thunderbird had fought the whale, and the shockwaves of that battle were felt across the greatest ocean on Earth. This race to uncover the past is a race against the present. The very coastline that holds these secrets is in a state of constant, violent flux. Winter storms pound the shore with ferocious energy, each wave clawing at the bluffs and eating away at the land. What took a tsunami minutes to bury, a season of storms can expose and destroy in days. An archaeologist might document a promising layer of shell hidden at the base of a cliff one autumn, only to return in the spring and find it completely gone, scoured away by the surf or collapsed in a fresh landslide. These sites are not sitting in a protected museum. They are perched on the edge of a hungry ocean. Every storm is a countdown, erasing irreplaceable data before it can be studied. The threat is accelerating. Human-caused sea level rise is now a relentless rising tide that amplifies every storm surge, pushing salt water further into fragile estuaries and speeding the erosion of already unstable shorelines. A village site that survived for 300 years in waterlogged mud could be oxidized and destroyed by exposure in a single decade. This makes the work a desperate salvage operation. Archaeologists are not just historians. They are first responders to a slow-motion emergency, working in narrow windows between winter rains and summer growth, knowing that the next big storm could be the one that wipes a chapter of history off the map forever. Yet the greatest imperative is not just scientific, it is ethical. These are not anonymous dig sites. They are the literal homes of ancestors, places where grandmothers told stories and children learned to fish. For the tribal nations of this coast, the discovery of a lost village is not an academic curiosity. It is the recovery of a sacred geography, a reconnection with family. Modern archaeology recognizes this profound truth. No serious work proceeds without the direct partnership and guidance of the descendant communities. Tribal historians, elders, and cultural resource officers are essential collaborators, not consultants. They provide context that no soil layer can, interpreting the placement of a post hole or the style of a tool in ways that illuminate social structure and belief. This collaboration ensures that research is conducted with reverence, that artifacts are treated with respect, and that the knowledge gained flows back to the people whose history it is. It transforms the process from an extraction of data into a shared act of remembrance. The goal is not merely to publish a paper, but to help mend a connection severed by the earth itself, to give a name back to a place that has been silent for centuries. In this way, the search for the lost villages becomes a healing journey, one that honors both the power of the past and the living voices of the present. A single stone tool can tell a story of its own. Found nestled in a layer of tsunami sand, it is more than an object, it is a moment frozen in time. This was not lost by accident. It was likely in someone's hand or stored in a basket inside a longhouse when the wave arrived. The type of stone, the style of flaking, even the wear patterns on its edge speak volumes. A finely crafted spear point made from obsidian, a volcanic glass traded from hundreds of miles away, tells of far-reaching networks and skilled artisans. A simple, well-used scraping tool for cleaning hides speaks to the daily, domestic work of a family. Each artifact pulled from the buried midden or the tsunami layer is a direct line to an individual's skill, trade, and daily routine. But perhaps the most fragile connections are those made from plants. In the rare, oxygen-starved conditions of waterlogged soils beneath the new tidal mud, even organic materials can survive. A fragment of a woven cedar bark basket, its intricate pattern still visible, is a whisper of someone's craftsmanship. A cord made from twisted spruce root, perhaps used to tie a tool or secure a mat to a wall, survives as a literal thread to the past. These are the belongings that decomposed quickly everywhere else, preserved here only because the disaster sealed them in a wet, dark tomb. They remind us that these were not primitive people, but creators and engineers whose material culture was sophisticated and perfectly adapted to their world. The most haunting finds, however, are not the possessions but the places. Discovering the charred remains of a hearth, a circle of fire-cracked rocks still blackened from its last cook fire, buried under 3 feet of sterile sand, is a profoundly intimate discovery. This was the heart of a home. The sand tells you the wave came and covered it, extinguishing it forever. Finding a massive cedar post snapped at its base and lying in a line with others outlines the ghost of a longhouse. You can trace its dimensions, see where families slept, where canoes were stored, where stories were told by the fire. These structural remains transform the site from an archaeological dig into a home. They force you to confront the suddenness of the event. This was not a slow abandonment. The post fell and was buried before it could rot. The hearth was covered before the rain could wash it away. These artifacts and features do not just tell us that people lived here. They tell us that life here stopped abruptly and completely on a winter night in 1700. They give names to the loss, not in words, but in wood and stone and woven fiber. What other intimate moments are waiting, pressed between layers of sand and mud, for their story to be heard? This cycle of destruction is not a one-time event. It is the heartbeat of this land. The Cascadia Subduction Zone has a rhythm, a terrible, recurring pulse that beats every 300 to 500 years. The cataclysm of 1700 was not the first. It was merely the most recent. The ghost forests and buried soils tell us this. Beneath the layer from that famous quake, geologists find another, older band of tsunami sand, and beneath that, another. Like pages in a book, the Earth records a history of violence, each layer a chapter of shaking, drowning, and rebirth. These paleoseismic records reveal at least 7 megaquakes of similar magnitude in the last 3,500 years. The land we walk on today is a landscape built by catastrophe, repeatedly shattered and remade. This changes everything about how we see the people who called it home. For the native cultures of this coast, the 1700 quake was not an unprecedented, unimaginable horror. It was the return of a known, if dreaded, visitor. Their oral traditions are not just memories of a single night. They are survival manuals refined over millennia. The stories of thunderbird and whale, the detailed instructions to flee to high ground when the earth shakes and the ocean recedes, these are not myths born from one event. They are cultural heirlooms, passed down through dozens of generations who lived through dozens of these cycles. They represent a profound, hard-won understanding of the land's deepest nature. Imagine a society that knows, in its bones, that the very ground beneath its villages will one day betray it. This knowledge must shape every aspect of life, from where you build your winter village, to how you structure your kinship networks with people inland, to the very way you pass knowledge to your children. Their resilience was not accidental, it was engineered by deep time. The decision to abandon a drowned village site and move upriver was not a panicked, one-time reaction. It was a practiced strategy, a cultural memory of what to do when the world shakes. The rich tapestry of languages and alliances that so confused early European observers may well be the direct result of this geological clock, forcing communities to merge, migrate, and adapt every few centuries. Their world was not static, it was dynamic, built around an expectation of periodic, total renewal by force. The lost villages of 1700 are not evidence of a culture's end, but of its incredible continuity. They are proof of a people who, again and again, faced the fury of the earth and the sea, and chose to remember, to adapt, and to carry their world forward on a journey away from the rising water. This long view asks us a difficult question: what does it mean to build a civilization not in spite of catastrophe, but with the certain knowledge that it will come? The geological clock is still ticking. The same forces that erased villages and reshaped coastlines over 3 centuries ago are not dormant. They are actively building pressure beneath our feet. Today, millions of people live in the shadow of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, in sprawling modern cities like Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver. Our world of steel, concrete, and glass is built upon the same landscape that once supported cedar longhouses. This presents a sobering parallel. The past shows us a pattern of survival through adaptation and migration. Our present challenge is whether we can learn that lesson in time. The science is unequivocal. A magnitude 9.0 earthquake is not a question of if, but when. The interval between major events averages 500 years, and the last one was in 1700. We are, by any measure, within the window for the next great rupture. When it happens, the shaking could last for 4 to 6 minutes, an eternity of violent convulsions that would dwarf any quake in modern American history. The immediate aftermath would be catastrophic. Unreinforced brick buildings and older concrete structures could collapse. Bridges designed before engineers understood seismic forces might fail. The real and present danger, however, lies beneath the surface. Much of the urban infrastructure in the Pacific Northwest is built on loose, water-saturated soils, especially in river valleys and reclaimed land. During intense shaking, this ground can undergo liquefaction, turning solid earth into something akin to quicksand. Buildings can tilt and sink, pipelines can snap, and roads can buckle. Imagine the water mains that supply drinking water and firefighting capacity shattering across the region. Picture the fuel pipelines and port facilities that drive the economy rupturing and spilling. Consider the landslides that would inevitably block critical highways and rail lines, the only lifelines for aid. The parallel to the past is stark. Just as the 17th century tsunami buried the lifelines of the native villages, their clam beds and freshwater springs, a modern megaquake threatens to sever our own lifelines of water, power, and transportation. Our society is far more complex and interdependent than those ancient communities, but our vulnerability is rooted in the same unstable ground. The stories of survival from 1700 offer a crucial insight. Resilience is not about preventing the disaster, but about preparing for its aftermath. Those cultures survived because they had knowledge, they knew to flee to high ground, and they had the social networks and flexibility to migrate and rebuild. Our preparation must be on a societal scale. It means retrofitting schools and hospitals to be safe havens. It means redesigning bridges and overpasses to withstand the shaking. It requires building tsunami evacuation towers along the coast and educating every single resident about the drop, cover, and hold on drill and the immediate need to move inland when the shaking stops. The most profound lesson from the lost villages is one of memory. The oral traditions endured because the trauma was woven into the fabric of the culture. For our modern society, the challenge is to build a cultural memory of a future event. We must move the Cascadia quake from the realm of abstract science into a shared, urgent reality that informs how we build, where we live, and how we plan to help each other. The ghost forests are a warning. The buried middens are a testament. The next chapter of this story is being written right now, in the decisions we make about our buildings, our infrastructure, and our willingness to listen to the deep history of the land we call home. The memory of that night was never truly lost. It was kept alive, carried across generations in the stories of the people who survived. Today, the descendants of those survivors are not merely inheritors of this history, they are its most vital guardians and interpreters. Across the Pacific Northwest, tribal nations have taken the lead in a profound cultural revitalization, one that actively weaves the lessons of the past into the fabric of the present. This movement is far more than academic interest. It is an act of reclamation and resilience. Tribal cultural resource departments are now essential partners in every major archaeological investigation. Where once outsiders might have come to dig and extract, today's work is guided by tribal priorities and protocols. A tribal archaeologist or a cultural liaison will be on site, ensuring that any excavation is done with respect, that artifacts are handled as ancestors, and that the knowledge gained serves the community first. This collaboration transforms the work. A pattern of post holes is not just a house outline to a tribal historian, it is a potential clan home, its orientation and size speaking to social structure. A stone tool's material can trace ancient trade routes that are remembered in family stories. The science provides the when and the how, but the tribal knowledge provides the irreplaceable who and the why, breathing life back into the silent soil. Alongside this fieldwork is a race against time to preserve living memory. Dedicated oral history projects, often led by tribal members themselves, are meticulously recording the stories of elders. These are not just the dramatic accounts of the Great Shaking, but the subtler knowledge, the names of places that no longer appear on any map, the descriptions of how a village was laid out, which families lived where, and where the canoes were pulled ashore. An elder's recollection of a berry-picking spot their grandmother mentioned, a place now deep underwater, becomes a crucial data point for reconstructing the pre-quake coastline. This recorded knowledge is a living database, a bridge connecting the archaeological evidence with the human experience it represents. Perhaps the most powerful element of this revitalization is the work to bring endangered languages back from the brink. Languages like Chinook Wawa, Clatsop, or Coos are not just collections of words, they are entire worldviews. They contain specific vocabulary for the coastal environment, for kinship, for the spiritual relationship with the land and sea. Revitalizing these languages is an act of recovering a cognitive map of the lost world. When a child learns the original name for a river or a mountain, they are not just learning a label, they are being handed a key to a door that has been closed for centuries. They are learning to see the landscape through the eyes of their ancestors, to understand its abundance and its perils as they did. These efforts create a powerful feedback loop. A language lesson might spark a question about an old village site. An archaeological discovery might prompt an elder to share a story they hadn't thought of in decades. A youth language camp might include a visit to a documented site, allowing a new generation to stand on the ground and say, in the words of their ancestors, "We are still here." This is the ultimate answer to the mystery of the lost villages. They were not erased. Their physical footprint was buried, but their essence, their stories, their names, their lessons, was carried forward in the hearts and minds of the people. The cultural revitalization happening today is the proof of that survival. It is a declaration that the trauma of 1700 was not an ending, but a terrible chapter in a much longer story of adaptation and continuity. The tribes are not just studying history, they are actively reassembling it, piece by precious piece, ensuring that the memory of those places and the people who call them home is not a ghost in the sand, but a living, guiding force for the future. What does this reclaimed history teach us about how to live on a land that remembers how to shake? A stone tool is not just an artifact, it is an ancestor's handiwork. The search for lost villages leads us to a fundamental and deeply ethical question: who truly owns this past? For descendant communities, the answer is unequivocal. The past is not a collection of objects to be studied, it is a living lineage. Human remains uncovered in a buried midden are not specimens, they are grandmothers and grandfathers. A broken fishing weight is not merely a clue to diet, it is a tangible piece of a life lived. This understanding has transformed the field of archaeology from a science of extraction to a practice of relationship. At the heart of this shift in the United States is a landmark law passed in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, known as NAGPRA. Its principle is simple and profound. It recognizes that Native American human remains, funerary objects, sacred items, and objects of cultural patrimony belong to their lineal descendants or culturally affiliated tribes. In practical terms, this means museums and universities across the country were required to inventory their collections and begin the process of returning these ancestors and their belongings home. For tribes whose villages were lost to the Cascadia quake, NAGPRA provides a legal and moral framework for reconnection. It acknowledges that an institution holding a basket from the Oregon coast is not merely a curator, but a temporary steward for a family heirloom. But the law's deeper impact is in how it shapes work in the field, right here on the eroding coastline. NAGPRA mandates consultation. This is not a box to be checked. It is an ongoing conversation that must happen before a single shovel touches the ground. When archaeologists identify a potential site, perhaps revealed by LiDAR or a storm-scoured cliff face, their first call is to the tribal historic preservation officer of the likely affiliated nations. Together, they assess the site's significance and vulnerability. They discuss the goals. Is this a rescue mission to save artifacts from the sea, or is the site best left undisturbed and protected? The tribe's traditional knowledge becomes the primary guide. Their oral histories might pinpoint the location of a cemetery or a ceremonial area, ensuring those sensitive places are treated with utmost reverence. This collaborative model turns discovery into a form of healing. For a tribe to help recover a carved spindle whorl or a stone maul from the very village their stories describe is an act of reclaiming not just an object, but a piece of their identity. It mends a thread severed by catastrophe and by centuries of historical trauma, where native history was often ignored or collected by outsiders. The work is no longer about what we can learn from the past, but what the past needs from us in the present. It asks us to listen, to follow, and to understand that some truths are not buried in the sand, but carried in the hearts of the people who never forgot. The map is far from complete. For every village site we have found, countless others remain hidden. Their stories still whispers in the wind. The sheer scale of loss is one of the great unanswered questions. How many communities dotted that ancient, gentler coastline? Dozens, hundreds. The death toll from that night is unknowable, a number lost to the waves, but the scale of the geological and oral evidence suggests it was catastrophic, reshaping the entire human geography of the coast. We are still piecing together the settlement patterns, the intricate web of main villages, seasonal camps, and resource sites that defined life here for millennia. Each discovery raises new questions. Finding a cluster of house platforms on a high terrace tells us people lived there, but were they there year-round, or was this a summer fishing camp? A scatter of stone tools in a tsunami sand layer confirms a village was destroyed, but where was its cemetery, its ceremonial ground, the places that held its deepest stories? These are the intimate details the earth has yet to surrender. Specific sites, named in oral histories, remain tantalizingly out of reach. Elders speak of places with names that no longer match any modern landmark, villages said to lie at the mouth of a stream that now flows into a bay that did not exist before the land sank. There are stories of a major trading hub, a place where canoes from many nations gathered, that has simply not been found. Is it buried under 50 feet of landslide debris on a mountain slope, or is it entirely submerged, its post holes now home to sea anemones and crabs? The search is ongoing and urgent. Every winter storm that gnaws at a cliff face is both a threat and an opportunity, potentially exposing a midden layer for the first time in centuries. Every new LiDAR flight over a previously unsurveyed valley might reveal the geometric shadows of another lost community. And every conversation with a tribal knowledge keeper, every recording of an elder's memory, adds another layer to the guidebook. A remembered story about a landslide that blocked a river, passed down as a family anecdote, can direct geologists to a specific area where a village might be entombed. The puzzle is immense, but the pieces are still being uncovered. Each one, whether it is a microscopic grain of pollen or the outline of a longhouse seen from the air, is a step toward answering the oldest question of all: who was here, and how did they live in a world they knew could end? The memory of those lost villages holds a mirror to our own time, reflecting lessons that are as urgent today as they were 3 centuries ago. This is not merely a story of destruction, but a masterclass in human endurance. The first and most humbling lesson is about the fundamental nature of the place we call home. The Pacific Northwest is not a static postcard. It is a dynamic, living geology with a terrible, recurring pulse. To build a life here, then or now, means accepting that the ground itself is a temporary arrangement. The ancestors did not see the land as a permanent possession, but as a partner in a relationship that included periods of violent renewal. Their villages were built with the understanding, carried in story, that they might have to leave them behind. This is a profound shift in perspective, from seeking permanent control to cultivating a resilient flexibility. The second lesson is written in the endurance of the stories themselves. Cultural memory, when woven into the fabric of identity, can outlast concrete and steel. For over 300 years, without a single written document, the precise sequence of the earthquake and tsunami was preserved, a survival guide encoded in narrative. This proves that the most vital infrastructure for facing disaster is not made of pipes and wires, but of shared knowledge, trusted relationships, and intergenerational communication. When the elders told of Thunderbird and Whale, they were not just recounting a myth. They were transmitting critical data about evacuation routes and natural warning signs. Their resilience was rooted in a community that knew how to listen to its past. Finally, the story teaches us about adaptation as a form of strength. The response to the cataclysm was not a passive surrender, but an active, collective recalibration. When the land became inhospitable, they moved. When populations were shattered, they merged. They reassembled their world in new places, carrying forward what they could not afford to lose: their language, their kinship systems, their stories. This adaptability stands in stark contrast to our modern tendency to rebuild in place, often in even more vulnerable ways, hoping the next disaster will not come in our lifetime. The people of the 1700 coast did not have that luxury. Their timeline was written in the ghost forests and the buried soils. They understood that survival sometimes means walking away from the ruins toward a new beginning. In remembering these lost places, we do more than solve a historical mystery. We honor the profound legacy of the people who navigated the unimaginable. We gather their hard-won wisdom, not as a relic but as a toolkit. Their experience asks us pressing questions. How do we build societies that are flexible, not just strong? How do we cultivate a memory that lasts longer than a generation? And how do we find the courage to make difficult choices before the ground shakes? The past does not repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The next great quake will test our modern world with forces as raw and powerful as those that swept away the cedar longhouses. The question is whether we have learned the oldest lesson of this coast, that resilience is not about preventing the storm, but about knowing how to sail in its wake. The journey ends where it began, with the quiet earth and the restless sea. We have followed the shadow of the Cascadia Megaquake from the sleeping fault beneath the waves to the silent testimony of the ghost forests and into the buried soils that hold the echoes of a world erased. We have listened to oral histories that carried the precise terror of that night across 300 years, and we have watched as lasers from the sky revealed the subtle footprints of homes long vanished. The lost villages of the Oregon coast are far more than an archaeological mystery. They are a haunting, human-scale reminder that the land we build upon is not a permanent stage, but a participant in a story of immense power and deep time. It has a memory written in sand and in story, a rhythm of destruction and rebirth that humbles our brief moment here. This history invites a personal reflection. What is the deep story of the ground beneath your own feet? Every region has its own geological personality, its own ancient events and human adaptations waiting to be understood. Seek out the indigenous history of your area, the original names of the rivers and mountains, the stories of the people who first called that place home. Their enduring connection often holds the keys to understanding the land's true nature. Let this knowledge inspire two things: preparedness and respect. Be prepared for the forces that shape your world, whether that means learning earthquake safety or understanding local floodplains, and cultivate a deep respect for the long human journey that preceded us, for the resilience etched into the landscape and carried in living memory. We are not the first to walk this ground, and the choices we make to listen, to learn, to remember will echo long after we are gone. The past is not a sealed tomb, but a conversation. It is time we learned to listen,